Hello, and welcome to another episode of Virtual Legality. I'm your host, Richard Hoeg, managing member of the Hoeg Law business law firm of Northville, Michigan. And once upon a time, there was a video game series called Assassin's Creed, and an entry in that series called Assassin's Creed Shadows, or it would be if the game ever released. Now, you might not think that a business lawyer would have a lot to say about a video game consistently being delayed by a video game company, but in this particular instance, that turns out to not be the case. Why? Well, let's take a look. First, let's look at some of the announcements for the delay. Originally, Assassin's Creed Shadows was set to come out November 15th, 2024, but it was delayed last fall in this first announcement. Dear players, Assassin's Creed Shadows is a dream project for us, finally bringing the series to feudal Japan with many features developed with our community in mind, such as parkour or the renewed stealth brought by new technology, all set in a beautiful and immersive world. And those that know me or know my appearances on other channels know that I'm a big fan of the Assassin's Creed series. This is an ambitious addition to the franchise, a rich experience that can be lived through the eyes of two unique protagonists, but we realize we need more time to polish and refine the experience, pushing further some of our key features. And all of this makes sense so far, right? We see this all the time in video game delays, especially after the somewhat tortured release of Cyberpunk 2077, which released in a state that not a lot of people liked, that Sony actually wound up pulling off of their storefront because its performance on the PlayStation 4 series of consoles was so unfortunate. So we see game companies now a little bit more reticent to release completely unfinished games or games in an unfinished state. And so for Assassin's Creed Shadows, this is a normal kind of announcement. As such, we've made the decision to postpone the release date to February 14th, 2025. The game will release on a broad range of platforms, including Steam, at launch. And that was a big move for Ubisoft because they have their own launcher and they were going to launch it on both launchers at once. Additionally, pre-orders will be refunded and all future pre-orders will be granted the first expansion for free. We understand this decision will come as disappointing news, especially to those who've been waiting patiently for an Assassin's Creed game inspired by feudal Japan, but we sincerely believe that this is in the best interest of the game and ultimately your experience as a player. Rest assured, we are looking forward to the moment you will embark on a memorable adventure with Nawe and Yasuke. Until then, we thank you for your ongoing support. So all is pretty much normal in Ubisoft world as of this announcement, except of course that it wasn't. And then an announcement came this week that further delayed the game, now releasing on March 20th, 2025, or so we assume. Dear players, we want to extend our heartfelt thanks to our incredible fans and dedicated teams for your unwavering support since our announcement in September to further refine and polish Assassin's Creed Shadows. Since November, we've been thrilled to share our progress through gameplay overviews, and the overwhelming excitement has truly inspired us. Each week has brought valuable feedback from our community. While we've already made remarkable strides, we believe a few additional weeks are needed to implement that feedback and ensure an even more ambitious and engaging day one experience. Accordingly, the new release date is March 20th, 2025. We remain committed to delivering a high-quality, immersive experience fostered by ongoing dialogue between our players and development teams. Again, a very kind of standard-looking delay announcement for a video game. We're going to try to fix it up. We're going to polish it even more. It's going to be even better than it would have been. Get excited about that, potential players, and hopefully engender what we see on social media from folks that are trying to look reasonable, which is to say, yes, take all the time you need to polish it. We don't want a broken game released like Cyberpunk 2077. But of course, Cyberpunk is only one kind of touch point in video games. And as I tell Twitter commenter Julius Caesar in his tweet here, I don't believe the official Julius Caesar, has been dead for a long time. Are we in for another Cyberpunk-like situation? I say, no, I don't think so. This is a story that's very different from all of that. I don't think this means that, I say, but I obviously can't promise one way or the other. This reads as far more about their tenuous capitalization table state to me. And what I mean by that is that Ubisoft, outside of Assassin's Creed Shadows, outside of any of this discussion, has been in a state of kind of limbo with respect to what their investors want of them, what their company is doing, because of the slate of releases that happened in 2024. Or, as Bloomberg reported last fall, Tencent, Guillemot family, said to consider buyout of Ubisoft. Right? In this particular case, for this particular company who has faced hostile takeover bids and other potential investment takeovers in the past, their company was doing so poorly in 2024 that they were looking to potentially have their major investor, Tencent, the Chinese corporation, and more on that in a minute, look to take over their company. In fact, I talked about this particular state of affairs on Last Stand Media. You can check that out. That is paywalled, but I have a long conversation with Colin Moriarty about that last year, and I was on a number of episodes with respect to that point. Or if you prefer a more freewheeling discussion where we talk about a lot of things, I'm on the Seasoned Gaming Bitcast every weekend talking about all things video games. And we did talk about Ubisoft and their situation a couple of times. You can check out that, and I will link that in the description to this video, or at least the podcast version of this video if you're watching later. Now, all that is to say, Ubisoft was in trouble, and they were delaying this game that was a major tentpole of their release schedule, not once now, but twice. And so the business lawyer in me sees something a little bit different from others. I look at this and say, all right, Assassin's Creed Shadows is now a huge bet for Ubisoft. It's a huge bet on their future success, on whether this current management structure, whether the Guillemot family, Yves, and everyone else can stay in control of this company. And when you make a bet of that size, sometimes if you're thinking about selling the company or thinking about trying to encourage other investment, it's more useful to have that asset value be essentially an unknown question mark than to have it locked in as a failure or maybe not as big of a success as you might need it to be. So I look at this story as that, and that was before I got some of the other announcements that happened as part of this story as well. Which is to say, Ubisoft didn't just delay Assassin's Creed yesterday. They also put out a strategic update that read as follows. Following the strategic and execution reviews initiated by the executive committee a few months ago, for those of you not following this story, what happened was Ubisoft was in potential takeover talks with Tencent, as reported by Bloomberg, but because the Yves Guillemot family trust, or the trust group, didn't want to lose control of the company, one of the things they did is try to stave off that potential takeover or investment attempt, was to have outside forces consult with the company and evaluate their strategic and execution at the company level. In other words, evaluate whether the management of the company, Yves Guillemot and friends, had a good strategic vision for how to utilize the assets of the company. And then if that vision was good, whether or not they were executing on that vision properly. So they initiated a review of that type to help stave off potential takeovers in the fall of last year. And now they say they are taking decisive steps to reshape the group in order to deliver best-in-class player experiences, enhance operational efficiency, and maximize value creation, which is all a lot of corporate speak, right? But what it basically says is they reviewed us. We're not going to talk about specifically what that review said, but we are now taking decisive steps to reshape the group, to move organizations around, potentially to, yes, have layoffs in the video game industry, to move people into different jurisdictions. We'll see that in a minute. And to enhance operational efficiency, to reduce costs and increase revenues and maximize value creation for our shareholders, which is why you gave us your money to begin with. Ubisoft announced today that it has appointed leading advisors to review and pursue various transformational strategic and capitalistic options to extract the best value for stakeholders. Now, this is really, really important. This is the most important thing that they said yesterday, even further than the Assassin's Creed delay. And that is to say, they are now having outside consultants look at the ways that they might package their company to potential new investors or to sales partners, including separating their assets up, presumably, to extract the best value for stakeholders. So you've invested money in Ubisoft. You want to get that money out. In a perfect world, you're getting that money out because they're using that money to make products that will make more money, and you'll get more money out that way. But if that isn't happening for whatever reason, whether it's bad management, bad execution, some other things that are happening in the marketplace, whatever it might be, you might look at the assets that the company already has and see if you don't just liquidate entirely. So now what Ubisoft is saying in so many corporate easy words is that they are looking at potential sales partners. They're looking at potential investors. They're even potentially looking at isolating their assets and selling them off in a different way to extract the best value for stakeholders, because they might not be best positioned to actually run this company as an operating entity into the future. This process will be overseen by the independent members of the board of directors. This entire statement is very defensive already, right? We had a strategic and execution level review. We're reshaping the group. We're adding value to stakeholders. Please don't fire us. Please don't come at us in a hostile takeover kind of situation. We are appointing advisors to come and look at ways to extract value for you investors. And also that process will be overseen not by the directors that have a tangible stake either in continuing as management or in their investor capacity, but by the independent members of the board that don't have that kind of vested interest in the company, whether it's in stock or management roles. Ubisoft will inform the market in accordance with applicable regulations if and once a transaction materializes. This is also important, as we will see in the reporting on this. You'll see an IGN article go out today or yesterday, depending on where you are, that says Ubisoft investors grill CEO, CFO on potential Tencent sale delays and financial woes. They will inform the market if and when appropriate. But when is that, says the subheadline. We also have another article from GameSpot. They refuse to comment on Tencent rumors, but say they are exploring options to maximize value. And Tencent is the major player here because they are the most significant investor outside the Guillemot family at Ubisoft. And of course, they have a lot of money to potentially throw around for a transaction like this one. But they won't say. And why won't they say? Well, that's a legal question in and of itself. And that has to do with being a public company, right? So for those of you that don't know, the Securities and Exchange Commission and other like bodies around the world essentially take the role of requiring public companies to disclose material information about their operations to investors on a very specified time frame so that nobody is left in the lurch by not knowing something or by somebody else knowing something in advance, right? The entire nature of secondary markets, the markets that sell shares of companies amongst each other and not from a primary issuer, the company itself, is that everybody has a similar amount of information. So in a situation like this, where the company is going out there and putting out a admittedly corporate easy statement that says, we are looking to sell or we're looking at potential sales venues, then we're not going to be allowed as Ubisoft to say that this one we think is going to go through or this one we think is not going to go through until something is actually signed, that there's some obligation between the parties, because we don't want anybody outside the company in a public market context to be disadvantaged by what they don't know, right? And this kind of situation, the shadow of an acquisition, as we might call it in the law, is the kind of thing where you do see potential for fraud. You do see the potential for insider trading, right? Because somebody in the room talking to Tencent or someone else is going to get a feeling for when the two sides are close, when the two sides are likely to enter into a letter of intent or some other binding obligation in the near future, and potentially could go and buy more stock or sell more stock if the transaction is the opposite of what we might think it would be, on the premise that they have this information and no more than the market itself does. That's where insiders get into trouble. But Ubisoft is at least saying the right things to the public now and saying, look, we are entered into talks. We've got advisors looking at these things. We are definitely making all the noises possible that we are looking at a potential transaction. But until we have something to actually tell you on a formal basis, we can't share anything with you. And yes, the IGNs and GameSpots of the world report on it as if they're withholding information, which makes sense from a certain point of view. But I'm here to tell you that from a legal point of view, the lawyers at Ubisoft or anyone else related to transactions like this are telling them, be very, very careful not to imply that something is closer to done than it is. Do not imply that something is definitely off the table or on the table, because we need to make sure that we don't offend the regulators here, and more importantly, our other investors, because if there is some kind of foot fault here, if there is some kind of technical disclosure that turns out not to be true, or potentially worse, turns out to be true, but people couldn't act on it because it wasn't through a formal mechanism, then we're going to get into a lot of trouble, potentially lawsuits from the regulators, potentially lawsuits from our own investors, potentially lawsuits from our sales partner, should it come down to it. There's a whole host of things that could happen in a bad way if information gets out that shouldn't get out in this context. So the lawyers are doing their jobs here, telling Ubisoft and their communications teams not to speak on specifics, to talk only in this kind of corporate easy sense, because we don't know whether any of these deal possibilities are going to come to complete fruition. Operationally, continues the Ubisoft statement, the company will continue to drive significant cost reductions, together with a highly selective approach to investments, and now expects to exceed 200 million euros in reduction of its fixed cost base by fiscal year 2025-26 versus fiscal year 22-23 on an annualized basis. So they are saying that they can go find another 200 million euros in cost savings, probably layoffs, admittedly, to go against what they were operating at just a few years ago. In December, X-Defiant was discontinued and 3 production studios in high-cost geographies were closed. Now, if you followed this stories with me, either on Last Stand or on Seasoned Gaming, you know that the high-cost geographies that were closed were those development houses in San Francisco that were working on X-Defiant. And one of the parts of the story that I have said in a number of instances now is that Ubisoft and other game publishers in this environment where AAA games are not selling the way that they hoped, where live service games are coming out and then bombing like Concord, is that they are going to be looking to reduce costs, not just in headcount, but in geography. California might be one of the most expensive places on earth to make video games. The United States alone one of the more expensive places on earth to make video games. So a company like Ubisoft that does operate out of France will have every incentive in the world to potentially look at other geographies that are maybe not so high cost in order to make their video games or other products. Additionally, as part of the renewed focus on gameplay quality and engaging day one experiences, it has been decided to provide an additional month of development to Assassin's Creed Shadows. Now, one thing I will say here, as part of this video, you'll hear me talk about Assassin's Creed delay be a part of this sales concept, right? We don't necessarily want this bet that we have made on ourselves that this game is going to help show what the future of Ubisoft can be to be something that is out there and shows that maybe that future isn't as strong as we had hoped. And so the delay makes sense in the context of the sale. That doesn't mean that I think they are lying here. In fact, I think that this communication, and in fact, all of Ubisoft's communications are very clearly vetted by regulatory and legal counsel to make sure that they aren't lying to their investors in this capacity. But I do think it maybe doesn't tell the complete story. This additional time will allow the team to better incorporate the player feedback gathered over the past 3 months and help create the best conditions for launch by continuing to engage closely with the increasingly positive Assassin's Creed community. The game is now scheduled for March 20th. So this is a story where Assassin's Creed Shadows is one of the most important things that Ubisoft has ever looked at in their entire history. And that's a part of this story even more than the polish or Cyberpunk 2077 issue in the video game community on the whole. Q3 fiscal year 24-25 net bookings are now expected at around 300 million euros, primarily reflecting lower than expected holiday sales, mainly for Star Wars Outlaws, as well as the discontinuation of X-Defiant. So every public company goes out there with projections about what they think they're going to do this year so that people know. They're saying that X-Defiant obviously didn't work out. They've canceled all production on that. Star Wars Outlaws, which was thought to be something of a gimme for Ubisoft, a big license for a big franchise with one of their biggest companies making it, and a game that they really believed in, didn't wind up selling as much as they had hoped. Obviously, if you follow this channel, you know I was a big fan of Star Wars Outlaws at the end of the day, even though I didn't like it when I first started playing it. But it didn't connect with audiences. Ubisoft doesn't exactly know why. And part of this story is also that they're skittish about Assassin's Creed Shadows, because if they didn't know why on basically everything that they released in 2024, what's to say that they know exactly what will sell in the Assassin's Creed or any other thing that they try to sell in 2025 and beyond. And I really liked how Christopher Dring put this, formerly of Games Industry Biz, now apparently writing for Video Games Chronicle, VGC, which is a site I really like, although this is a pretty big sellout of the advertisement space on this particular article. And he frames the Ubisoft story, I think, pretty well here. Practically everything Ubisoft tried to do last year underperformed, as new IPs, Skull and Bones and X-Defiant were always a risk, especially when trying to compete in the seemingly impenetrable live service space, and they certainly didn't deliver what was needed. Meanwhile, Star Wars Outlaws was a hugely disappointing launch from a commercial point of view. A seemingly decent game, more than decent, I would say, from one of Ubisoft's most acclaimed studios based on a major IP, and after a successful reveal at Summer Games Fest 2023, it felt like a bankable hit. Yet it missed spectacularly. Across Europe, the game was the 47th best-selling game of the year and sold less than Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which was released the year before. That spooked the company when it came to Assassin's Creed Shadows, which as the firm's own IP is a lot more commercially significant. I do think it's very, very significant, and the company is now in a situation where they basically bet on it being the pillar of their future, but I don't think that makes it more significant than Star Wars. Star Wars was a very significant outlay. It's just that they had a licensing fee that they would have had to pay to Disney/Lucasfilm. However, after a string of disappointments, it perhaps speaks to fading confidence in its overall creative decisions. And then Mr. Dring goes on to do some analysis in this article that you can, of course, read. I highly recommend checking it out, that I don't necessarily agree with, but it is useful to see different perspectives on these stories. And after all this happened, we have another Bloomberg article talking about Ubisoft shares sinking after the Assassin's Creed Shadows delay. So Ubisoft continues to be in trouble. Ubisoft continues to be potentially looking at a purchase by Tencent Holdings. Whether they want to purchase them or not is an open question. And part of the story here is also that the Guillemot family has apparently said that they don't want to give up control as part of any purchase, which you can organize in a sale of a company like this one. But I really think that the story of this particular moment in time is that Ubisoft is delaying Assassin's Creed probably to give it some more polish. You can always get more polish in video games, even after releases, we see with patches nowadays, but also because they don't actually want that target to be known. They don't want whether Assassin's Creed Shadows is as successful as they need it to be known as part of the conversations that are happening with their consultants and potential outside purchasers like Tencent and anyone else that may come to the table. Now, if you're in the business world, you might say, Rick, aren't there contractual ways to handle it from the Tencent or other perspective? And I would say, yes, there are. There are things called earnouts, right? And I brought up this Investopedia article to talk about them with you here. But an earnout is a pretty simple concept, right? You've got a buyer that says this company is worth $10 billion. And a seller that says, no, it's definitely not. It's worth $1 million maybe. And the seller says, no, we've got a product that's going to come out. It's going to light the world on fire. And why shouldn't we make some of the profits out of that process? Why should you get them all just from buying in at the last minute? Well, an earnout is a contractual provision that says, okay, well, we'll pay you the $1 million we think the company is worth right now. But how about we also say we owe you X amount of additional dollars if this product that's going to light the world on fire hits these markers after we bought the company, right? We can set up a conditional payment price that has to be worked through with tax lawyers and financial advisors and everyone else to make sure nobody gets totally screwed over by taxation and the like. But we can do that. This is described as an earnout. Often when buyers and sellers want to complete a deal but can't agree on the price, they employ a strategy called an earnout. So you can easily imagine that even with Ubisoft saying, well, we're not going to settle this Assassin's Creed value proposition right now. We're going to push it out until we've probably had to enter into an LOI or some kind of early stages of a deal with Tencent or someone else. And so that risk is going to be borne by you, Tencent, or other buyer, and not so much by us, that a contractual provision will be put in that says, okay, well, you want X amount of dollars for your company or for your shares or however we organize this deal. We're still going to say it's only going to be more if Assassin's Creed Shadows does X, Y, or Z out there. You can still potentially arbitrage that opportunity. You can make a certain amount of money. You can allocate risk between the parties just by setting those numbers and thresholds in a way that is more advantageous to one side or the other. So I think it's possible that Ubisoft, through its advisors, consultants, or otherwise, is looking at the situation and saying, we don't want to put a marker in the sand. We don't want folks to know how successful or not successful the Assassin's Creed Shadows product is going to be out there in the market, because that will have a deleterious effect on our ability to sell the company at the value we want to get. And that's a part of the story. That's a part of the story they can't say in so many words. Instead, they'll use the typical video game language to say, we're going to polish this up. We're going to delay it another month. But that's, in my view, what I see happening here. I don't think anybody's lying. I don't think anybody's violating laws by putting it in the way that they have put it here. But I think it's an important part of the story, and I would have folks see it that way, because I think that Ubisoft is in a lot of trouble. I think Ubisoft is looking to sell their company. They've said it in so many words in their own commentary and documentation. And I think that part of the story maybe isn't being as covered online as well as I would like to see it covered. So that's why I had a Virtual Legality today. I hope you found it useful and interesting. The last thing I will say on this topic before I send you out is that the buyer in this question has its own kind of issues happening at the same time, but that is part of a future conversation. So Tencent, potential buyer of Ubisoft. I do think Ubisoft is very likely to have organizational and structural changes of a very significant kind in the very near future, whether that's just switching geographies of their studios, whether that's a severe reduction in headcount, a severe reduction in the products that they are making in 2025 and beyond, or the wholesale sale of their company to Tencent or someone else, or the bifurcation of their assets to a whole host of companies, like what happened in the THQ bankruptcy so many years ago. I can't say, but I do think we're looking at a very significant kind of inflection point for the video game industry and for Ubisoft in particular. And again, I hope you found this conversation to be interesting. If you did, please consider supporting Virtual Legality on places like Playeur and Patreon. And I will add the links to Playeur and Patreon to the podcast description as well for folks that are listening to this in podcast form, as recommended by a friend of the channel, or memberships and super chats on YouTube. Every little bit helps. If none of that works for you, if you're not just in a position to do that, or you don't want to, that's totally fine as well. Just subscribing, becoming a member potentially, telling your friends, letting folks know we're having these conversations in this space. Every little bit helps. Thank you so much, and I will catch you on the next episode of Virtual Legality.
Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.